Get ready for a flashback to 1985, except greener. The Game Boy launch looks a lot like the NES launch in this episode of Game Boy Works.
This great Hangout for Our Dance contest this week. Now, is everybody ready? Yeah!
I stated a few episodes ago that Game Boy's designers drew heavily upon their previous work with the Game & Watch line for their inspiration for the Game Boy. And that's true. But as you can see from the system's non-Tetris launch lineup, the NES had a lot of impact on the Game Boy's design and inspiration as well. The Game Boy had multiple parents, being the collaborative, corporate effort that it was. And each of those key figures brought different ideas to the table. The final Game Boy hardware represents a blend of all of those influences, a mix of compromises and contributions that resulted in the unique device that we ended up with. Nintendo R&D1 head Gunpei Yokoi, who had originally conceived the Game & Watch line and pushed for economic materials in all of his design, naturally looked to his own prior work for inspiration. On the other hand, his boots-on-the-ground second-in-command, Satoru Okada, wanted to produce a device that pushed well beyond the bounds of the Microvision, Game Pocket Computer, and computer game Yakuman, older portable devices that had already employed monochromatic dot matrix graphics. According to Okada in a 2016 interview, his ideal Game Boy would have been a portable NES. However, Yokoi hated this idea, since a system with those kinds of capabilities would have been expensive and power-hungry, conflicting with his own platonic ideals for gadgetry. But Nintendo's upper management didn't immediately shoot down Okada's notion. It's hard to say if an NES-caliber Game Boy ever would have seen the light of day, even if it had gone into full development. But in the end, Okada couldn't clear the final hurdle to taking his concept into the development process, an obstacle by the name of Masayuki Uemura. As the NES and Famicom's hardware engineer, Uemura ultimately had say over the industrial processes related to that platform. And Uemura said no. Not because he hated the notion of a beefy portable version of his own work, but because that work had already moved along to its next iteration. Nintendo's R&D3 team had already immersed themselves in the Super NES design and development process. By the time development began on Game Boy in earnest, the Famicom's successor was far enough along that Uemura had already decided to build the console around a 16-bit version of the same processor that powered the older system. This meant that manufacturer Sharp would produce the new console's CPU, and they'd dedicated their available resources to crafting that 16-bit chip. With the path to a portable Famicom blocked by chip design and fabrication bandwidth limitations, Okada and Yokoi came to an accord and created a system that ultimately builds on portable precedent more than it draws from Famicom's legacy. The Game Boy lacked a color screen and NES backward compatibility. It felt for all the world like someone had juiced up the Epoch Game Pocket Computer into a gadget with NES-level power, while shrinking it down to half the size of Epoch's device. Game Boy combined the strengths of the Game & Watch line, that is to say its low price, its durability, its energy-conscious innards, and its iconic D-pad controller, with the strengths of the NES. That is to say, its more robust processing power and audio capabilities compared with older portables, an appealing form factor, and most of all, its marketing clout and expansive library. The latter ultimately mattered the most. Game Boy lacked the retail kiosk visual appeal of the Atari Lynx, and its vaunted battery economy wasn't the sort of thing you'd pick up on immediately in a 5-minute retail demo session. But what did come through clearly was the fact that Game Boy shipped with familiar, recognizable games. Titles and designs that Nintendo fans would have recognized from the black box era of the NES. That old NES software may no longer have been available in stores by 1989, but the carts remained in circulation, having become a part of seemingly every NES owner's collection. Even newly minted NES owners who joined the ranks of the install base long after Nintendo phased out the black box titles inevitably owned one or two black box carts that they had acquired as gifts, through trades with friends, or at garage sales. No one knew what the hell Gates of Zindakon or Electrocop were, but Super Mario and baseball? This was summer 1989, the pinnacle of NES's power. Unless you were the child of that handful of aging hippies who went off the grid in order to protest against Reagan instead of just becoming yuppies, you knew exactly what these games were about. I feel that the NES Game Boy parallels come through more clearly in the US than in Japan. The Game Boy's US launch lineup resembles a compact summary of the US NES launch library. It's not really a big deal, but I do believe that the Game Boy launch lineup's similarities to the US NES launch lineup helped create the impression of a portable NES companion, so crucial, along with Tetris, to the system's early success. And in fact, two of the first standalone software selections for Game Boy, Baseball and Super Mario Land, neatly reprise the chronological bookends of the NES launch library. Baseball is the first NES launch game by NES Works reckoning, which is to say that it was the oldest of the black box titles available at launch, having debuted in Japan in December 1983. And Super Mario Bros. Was the last launch title, having arrived on Famicom just a few weeks before the system's US launch. A game so new at the time that it barely even figured into Nintendo of America's initial NES marketing, despite its undeniable appeal at the time and historic impact in hindsight. So while the Game Boy's launch lineup was a grab bag of concepts, here in the US it worked as a direct alpha to omega recap of the NES's own day one titles. Does any of this actually matter? Well, no. It's really just a shaggy dog observation. Anyway, here's baseball. Forget Tetris, forget Mario. No Game Boy cartridge was more inevitable than baseball. As a professional sport, baseball has really fallen off a cliff here in the US. Not enough traumatic brain-damaging head injuries, I guess, but in Japan it's still huge. It first reached Japan in the 1870s, predating Nintendo's existence by a couple of decades and making it, perhaps, the first American import to become a hit in that country. Baseball has yet to wane in popularity in Japan a century and a half later, and the country's love for the sport hit fever pitch for video gamers during the Famicom era. Go back through Japan's games-related publications in the late 80s, and you absolutely cannot escape baseball. We saw only a tiny fraction of Famicom and Mark III's baseball output here in the US, but back in Japan, you could crush up the total output of baseball carts from the 8-bit era and construct a pretty impressive new artificial island in Tokyo Bay. And what did Japanese game developers use as the lodestar for their baseball projects? That's right, Nintendo's Baseball for Famicom, released in December 1983. While not the first ever baseball video game, even in Japan, NES Baseball largely defined the Japanese take on the sport. It dropped the stick figures and lightweight play design of earlier works like Baseball for CassetteVision and Champion Baseball for SG-1000 in favor of a more visually appealing and mechanically rich approach. Its little cartoon batters and fielders packed a lot of personality, and both the pitching and batting systems allowed players a lot more fine control over their actions than had been seen in earlier games from Japan. Batters could shift back and forth in the batting box, time their swings, and even adjust the height of their bat. And do it all pretty much on the fly during the split second between the ball leaving the pitcher's mound and crossing home plate. Likewise, pitchers could dictate their throw before releasing the ball, and during its flight. While not a whole lot of fun against the CPU, Baseball for NES really did a great job of capturing the tactical essence of the sport without all the boring stuff in between pitches. On top of that, the alternating display mode allowed players a full view of the entire field after a hit, while allowing a more detailed, up-close infield perspective for pitching and batting. More than a dozen different developers copied the NES baseball model. Namco effectively canonized it in 1986 with Family Stadium, aka RBI Baseball. Needless to say, Nintendo would have been idiots not to follow up on that legacy for Game Boy. In the US, we bought Game Boy because of Tetris and Super Mario Land, and I'm sure that's true of Japan as well. But I have to think that the prospect of a proper, fully featured baseball game on the go, miles beyond anything available for Game & Watch style LCD handhelds, did as much to drive Game Boy sales there as any other title. And that's perfectly fair. Baseball for Game Boy doesn't reinvent the genre or anything, but it does play more or less like a proper sequel to NES Baseball. If they'd called this Baseball 2, no one would have blinked. About all the Game Boy Baseball lacks over the NES game is color. Everything else about it demonstrates the right level of refinement to make this a groundbreaking take on the sport for a handheld in 1989. For starters, monochromatic color scheme aside, baseball has a beefier, more impressive look on Game Boy. The camera in the batting perspective sits lower to the ground and closer to home plate, emphasizing the batter over the pitcher and making the fielders even smaller to simulate their relative distances from home plate. The fielding view that takes over once the batter connects with the ball also brings the camera in closer to the action, rather than attempting to present the entire ball field in a single image, which would have involved harsh visual compromises given Game Boy's low resolution, the fielding view instead sits at more of a middle distance. The camera shifts to an overhead point and presents much more of the action in frame than the batting view does, but you only see a slice of the field at any given time. The camera centers on the baseball, which ensures that you don't lose sight of the ball, even if it does mean that you sometimes have to guess at the position of fielders near the ball's inevitable point of impact. It's not perfect, but it's more dynamic than the NES game's approach, by necessity in both cases. Where the Game Boy's low pixel resolution practically demanded this setup, the NES couldn't have taken a similar approach in 1983. You didn't see this kind of multi-directional free scrolling on NES until Hudson published Raid on Bungling Bay in 1985. Up until that point, NES programmers simply didn't seem to have a handle on the logistics of multi-directional scrolling for a console that only offered hardware support for single-direction scrolling. So it's a minor detail, but the camera system in this baseball adaptation does demonstrate just how far Game Boy started ahead of the state of Famicom and NES software in its earliest days. Yet this choice also works against baseball. Nintendo pushed Game Boy's Link functionality hard in its early days, and understandably so. They knew that games like Ice Climber and Ikari Warriors are miserable experiences when played solo, redeemed by the social aspect of competitive and cooperative play. Somewhere deep in their soul, perhaps Nintendo executives caught a glimpse of the future resonating through the timeline, the realization that Pokemon's Link support would someday save the company. Whatever the case, baseball supports Link mode for two-player experiences, allowing each player to tackle the game on their own little screen. There's a missed opportunity here in that the field perspective doesn't change for players based on their current role. The Link feature would be even more convincing, I think, if the pitching phase of the game took on a bases-loaded type viewpoint, setting the camera behind the mound. That's a minor coulda shoulda woulda quibble that probably would have been impossible in baseball's tiny 16KB ROM. A more concrete point of criticism here stems from the fact that baseball emphasizes multiplayer so hard that the single-player mode becomes utterly miserable. I've covered a lot of 8-bit baseball adaptations here over the past decade, and I've invariably found their unbalanced relationship between single and multiplayer modes irritating. But returning to Game Boy Baseball after all this time has been eye-opening. This is by far the most lopsided solo baseball experience I've ever covered here. The computer's brutal efficiency and the zoomed-in fielding perspective combine to create a take on sports that wildly favors the CPU. The first time I sat down to refresh my memory for the script, the computer started the game by taking out my side in 3 pitches, before stepping up to the plate and scoring a home run on its very first swing. It's that kind of game, which I suppose is the point. Playing alone misses the point. Baseball appealed to American and Japanese enthusiasm for the sport alike, offering a portable rendition of the sport that may have paled in comparison to the likes of Tecmo Baseball and Baseball Stars, but which utterly annihilated any previous baseball adaptation that you could play on the go. But at the same time, it punished children whose friends didn't buy a Game Boy and a copy of baseball by tuning the CPU to utterly and ruthlessly stomp them into a mud hole. I suppose there are valuable lessons to be learned here about the mercenary nature of capitalism and the unforgiving reality of competitive sports, but mostly, my takeaway is that I hope I don't have to touch this game again for another decade. But don't feel bad, friendless Game Boy owners. Nintendo didn't forget about you. Super Mario Land does nothing to make use of link cable functionality. It's a strictly solo experience. It's also the slightest Mario platform game ever made by Nintendo, by far. At a paltry 12 stages, you can absolutely blow through Super Mario Land in less than half an hour, without warps. Super Mario Land doesn't even include warps. I mean, why would it? It's only 12 stages long. I'd also argue that it's the easiest Mario platform game ever produced by Nintendo, too. Super Mario Land dispenses 1-ups pretty generously through its end-of-stage minigames, which allow you to gamble for extra lives with an Amadakuji lottery if you can navigate your way to the alternate stage goal at the top of the screen. And really, all of these things are fine. Super Mario Land lacks a certain degree of the substance and refinement that one comes to expect from Mario platform games, it's true. But you can't exactly hold that against the game or its creators when you consider what it competed against. Nothing. That's what it competed against. There had never been a portable, side-scrolling platform action game this detailed and rich in content before, ever. Super Mario Land shipped less than a year after the original widescreen Super Mario Bros. Game & Watch. All things considered, that Game & Watch had been kind of amazing. and somehow wrangled the limited capabilities of that line's preset LCD display elements into a passable simulation of a game that set the standard for design and mechanics for platform action games. But that handheld still amounted to Mario scrambling across little interchangeable segments and didn't exactly capture the nimble athleticism of his high jumping skills. Super Mario Land, on the other hand, did a pretty solid job of it. And it did so across 4 different kingdoms, packed with distinct monsters, hazards, and background visuals. Admittedly, it suffers unavoidably from running on Game Boy. Not only is it trivially brief and trivially easy, it doesn't fully capture the smooth feel of a Mario console platformer. The designers elected to maintain similar proportions between Mario's sprite and the surrounding screen borders. Given Game Boy's tiny resolution, this meant Mario had to shrink down to such a tiny size that he barely reads as a human figure. And that's fine. Super Mario Land doesn't look particularly gorgeous with its minuscule sprites, but it gives the player lots of room to breathe, and it prevents the screen edges from crowding the gameplay, which can lead to unfair losses and enemy ambushes in games that attempt to maintain NES-level detail and sprite resolution on the Game Boy's dinky screen. However, it does have a small, literally small, knock-on effect for gameplay. Because Mario's sprite consists of so few pixels, the action here doesn't feel as smooth as in his console outings. The pixel grid becomes more obvious at this scale, giving both the hero and his foes more of a jumpy, rigid kind of movement, which results in more awkward sprite interactions and collisions. That complaint is admittedly anachronistic. The granular motion of on-screen objects wasn't evident on actual Game Boy hardware. The small size and sluggish refresh rate of the built-in screen did a lot to smooth over those quirks, and it's only evident when you play on Super Game Boy or some other modern device with clearer visuals. But it makes for a slightly rockier Mario experience than we've come to expect from Nintendo. I mean, it's no Super Mario Special, but even the original NES version of Mario Bros. Felt more graceful than this. Again, though, the limitations of the Game Boy hardware did a lot to provide a smokescreen for Super Mario Land's more awkward elements, as did the fact that, overall, this is a pretty strange derivation of the Mario platforming concept. Everything in Super Mario Land feels a little off from the world that we know and love. It's not that everything is radically different here, as in Super Mario Bros. 2 USA, but rather that it all seems similar to the standard Super Mario Bros. Elements Nintendo fans knew and loved by this point, but sat a little off-kilter. Rather than Koopa Troopas, you fight Nokobones, their strange explosive cousins. Bowser is replaced by Tatanga, an alien. Wasps fly past in place of Lakitu, dropping spears instead of spinies. Bullet bills are replaced by rocket-powered missiles, and indestructible fish skeletons replace Cheep Cheeps. Mario can collect a power-up flower, but it allows him to toss a small ball that ricochets around the screen instead of a bouncing fireball. And sometimes he hops into a vehicle and shoots things. A lot of these changes make sense when you consider the limitations of the Game Boy and the fact that the development team behind Super Mario Land, despite having designed the hardware, didn't have a full handle on how to wring the most from this new machine. The Nokobones, for example, explode when Mario stomps on them, likely because the murky Game Boy screen might have made it difficult to track fast-moving shells if you could kick them like normal Koopas. Spears in place of spinies? Well, the weapons simply fly downward and vanish from the screen, instead of becoming independent moving creatures that would tax the CPU. The fish skeletons rise and fall in simple up-down patterns rather than zipping speedily in variable arcs that home in on Mario. And so forth. Basically, everything in Super Mario Land that behaves a little differently than the monsters in Super Mario Bros. Seemingly does so in order to simplify the calculations that the CPU has to manage while minimizing the complexity of movement into patterns that read easily on the Game Boy screen. Super Mario Land is exactly what it needs to be. Super Mario simplified into a form that works perfectly on this handheld system. And it's not as though the game doesn't include lots of interesting twists to keep things lively. World 3 forces you to manage a constant string of rolling boulders, including segments where you need to ride the bounding rocks over otherwise impassable stretches of dangerous ground, a challenge seemingly drawn from leaping on and grabbing rocks during the claw grip battle in Super Mario Bros. 2, expanded into a platforming challenge. Each stage features a different geographical setting that goes beyond the simple palette shifts of Super Mario Bros. And the environmental wallpaper of Super Mario Bros. 2 USA. The monsters and challenges found in each world tie to the theme of that land. Angry Moai monsters in the Easter Island-like Easton Kingdom. Fire-breathing seahorses, possibly on loan from Metroid, in the ocean-themed Muda Kingdom. Hopping Chinese vampires in the Chai Kingdom, and so on. It's a brief game, but it packs a lot of variety into its dozen stages. Nearly every level features a distinct mix of monsters and environmental hazards ranging from pipe gauntlets to falling platforms to fire-breathing Sphinx guardians. As a Mario game, it can be a little underwhelming. As a showcase of the Game Boy's capabilities, however, it demonstrates the fact that the system had the potential to support games on par creatively, if not technically, with the NES library. About the only thing it's lacking is, well, the Game Boy's most marketed feature, link support. But hey, nobody's perfect. It's funny though, I've dwelt a fair bit over the years on the way localization delays caused the American and Japanese 8-bit experiences to land very differently for those respective audiences, to say nothing of how they came across in Europe. For instance, I've recently seen people muse about the way Dragon Warrior's ruined town of Hawksness affected them as kids. It was a pretty interesting idea. A city reduced to rubble and overrun with monsters, subverting the visual vocabulary of town tile maps, which normally read as safe, in order to demonstrate the threat that the evil Dragon Lord represented to the people of Alafgard. It's a good trick, so good in fact that Nintendo borrowed it a year later for the town of Old Kasuto in Zelda 2. Except that in the US, Zelda 2 arrived more than half a year before Dragon Warrior. So when I eventually played Dragon Warrior, Hawksness just struck me as business as usual, a neat thing that you'd always find in these grand adventure games. And even the Super Mario series suffered from such localization delays, despite the games requiring almost no localization whatsoever. Nintendo shipped Super Mario Bros. 2 about 10 months after the first game in Japan, but they never shipped that Mario 2 here. Instead, as you know, we got a ROM hack of an unrelated game as Super Mario Bros. 2 a full 3 years after the original Super Mario showed up alongside the NES at launch. At the same time that we received our Super Mario 2, Super Mario Bros. 3 arrived on Famicom, and then about half a year later, Super Mario Land showed up on the Japanese Game Boy, followed 3 months later by its US debut. Super Mario Bros. 3 wouldn't hit the US until early 1990. Not only did this mean that the Super Mario games had a clearer through line of design inspiration in Japan than they did here, Japanese fans saw a string of brisk platformers starring Mario rather than being sidetracked by a game about Mario and friends taking a leisurely cruise through the Dream Kingdom to pluck vegetables. And it also meant that Super Mario Land came off as more of a chaser in Japan, a quick portable shot to cap the series' 8-bit trilogy before the following year's Super NES launch and Super Mario World. Here though, it was more of a teaser for Super Mario Bros. 3, a game that would see some major coverage unfold in both magazines and movie theaters a few months after the Game Boy's launch. I've talked about this before, but I haven't touched on just how this timeline makes Super Mario Land's lack of any sort of multiplayer feel kind of bizarre. Sure, America's Super Mario 2 lacked any sort of multiplayer whatsoever, but that game had a vibe and structure unlike any other Mario game of the era. Whether you saw Super Mario Land in its Japanese context as a grace note for Mario's 8-bit adventures, or in the US context as a reversion to the feel of the original Super Mario Bros., the game really does seem like it should have had some sort of link cable support. Sure, the alternating two-person play setup wouldn't make any sense on Game Boy. Why sit and wait impatiently for the other person to lose a guy when you had your own screen? But Super Mario Bros. 3 had introduced a handful of multiplayer components to the Super Mario sandbox, which involved a more direct form of interactivity to keep those alternating sessions lively. One of those components directly mimicked the original pre-Super Mario Bros. Meanwhile, here's a Mario adventure that draws heavily upon the legacy of the original Mario Bros., which absolutely begs for the inclusion of a monochromatic minigame Mario Bros. Mode, yet curiously lacks one. I don't think this is some unreasonable expectation. The original Mario Bros. Represents the branching point for Nintendo's internal development, the last major release that Shigeru Miyamoto designed and Gunpei Yokoi produced, before Miyamoto was bumped to producer and given the reins of his own R&D4 division, also known as Nintendo EAD. From here, Miyamoto would work on future Mario games, taking the little guy into super form, with his own staff, including designer Takashi Tezuka and composer Koji Kondo. Yokoi would still occasionally oversee Mario-related projects, but they tended to be weird ones, like this one and Wrecking Crew and Mario Paint, designed by R&D1 staff like Hirofumi Matsuoka and composer Hirokazu Tanaka, who, incidentally, had handled the audio design for Mario Bros. So here you have a system designed for linking with music by the guy who designed the link cable, drawing upon the original Mario Bros. In ways Mario's other adventures didn't. Check out those Fighterfly-looking guys. And it ultimately fails to include a multiplayer component, even the Mario Bros. Derived play mode of Super Mario Bros. 3. What a weird absence! I can only guess that the limited ROM sizes of the early Game Boy lineup would have made such a thing impossible. Game Boy didn't experience the radical upgrades throughout its life that NES and Famicom did by way of on-cart supplemental chips, but Nintendo did produce a handful of different cartridge boards featuring somewhat advanced memory management schemes. And in fact, the first of those memory managers debuted as early as Super Mario Land. As far as I'm aware, the other launch games for Game Boy didn't include any sort of onboard memory mapping, and operated within the system's default addressable data storage. Super Mario Land, however, demanded more space and shipped on the first Game Boy mapper chip, the MBC-1, which allowed it to access additional data in chunks of 16 kilobytes. This made Super Mario Land the most expensive of the system's launch titles, with its onboard hardware that allowed it to contain twice as much data as the system's other Day 1 carts. So I guess this is why Super Mario Land is a strictly solo experience that does nothing to showcase the Game Boy's all-important Link capabilities. And sure, there's validity to this approach as well. Not every game has to include some sort of shoehorned multiplayer option. In fact, I wish Nintendo had kept in mind during the DS era. And this cartridge came packed with some interesting alternate gameplay concepts that really set Super Mario Land apart from its peers. In the end, I think there's more value in shifting into auto-scrolling combat, or playing an Amidakuji lottery for extra lives, than in clumsily connecting two systems to go head-to-head for some kind of distraction that probably wouldn't have tied back to the core adventure. But it does seem like a bit of a missed opportunity for Nintendo's designers to go a little wild and come up with some interesting new concept of what multiplayer Mario could even mean. It also means that this adventure strictly stars Mario, with no Luigi to be found, even though the franchise has since taken to pairing up this game's Princess Daisy as Luigi's prospective romantic interest. Super Mario Land takes a skewed approach to being a Mario platformer, and it feels decidedly like an R&D 1 game. Its Super Mario is made by a bunch of people who didn't normally make Super Mario games, doing their best to Super Mario it up, but ultimately coming up with something much quirkier and in some ways more interesting. The Super Mario Land team, or at least the larger R&D 1 group, would make several sequels to this cart throughout the Game Boy family's existence. With Super Mario Land 2, they fell into the trap of trying to put NES-style sprites on Game Boy, which undeniably impacts the game's playability, though the setting and mechanics are even stranger than those of Super Mario Land, which helps salvage the overall experience. They'd finally get it right with Super Mario Land 3 by completely abandoning Mario. That sequel shifted its focus entirely to antagonist Wario, a large, sluggish character whose bulk forced the action to skew from typical Mario fare to a slower, more exploratory style that worked better on a system with slow, grimy, low-resolution graphics. Here though, Super Mario Land definitely feels like a lesser version of Super Mario Bros. In a lot of ways, which did reinforce the feeling that the Game Boy was the weak substitute for an NES. But those who really paid attention to the action here realized that Super Mario Land wasn't a worse take on Mario, just a weird and different one. Nintendo said basically nothing about baseball. Nothing serves it right. Super Mario Land, on the other hand, got about as much coverage as Nintendo Power ever bothered to spare for a Game Boy release in the early days, which is to say about 2 pages, plus a little bit of a recap in the Game Boy Player's Guide. Next time on Game Boy Works, the NES's launch lineup continues to reverberate all the way through the very end of its handheld cousin's debut titles.